On February 5, 2003, Colin Powell sat in the United Nations Security Council chamber and held up a small glass vial. He was 65 years old, a decorated four-star general, and the most trusted figure in American public life. The vial, he explained, could hold enough anthrax to shut down the U.S. Senate. He pointed to satellite photographs. He played intercepted audio recordings. He described mobile biological laboratories, aluminium tubes for centrifuges, and connections to terrorist networks. The intelligence, he said, was solid. The case was overwhelming. Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and the world needed to act. 6 weeks later, American forces crossed the border. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad fell. Within 3 months, the insurgency began. Within 3 years, Iraq had descended into sectarian civil war. The weapons were never found. The mobile laboratories did not exist. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. And Colin Powell, the man who had staked his reputation on the case for war, would later call it a permanent blot on his record. What happened in Iraq explains everything about why powerful nations keep stumbling into wars they cannot win, and why the warning signs keep getting ignored even when they are in plain sight. This is not a story about one administration's mistakes. The Iraq War was not an aberration, it was a pattern, one that has repeated across centuries, across empires, and across political systems. The question is not simply how the Iraq War happened. The question is why the same catastrophe keeps happening. What makes powerful nations convinced they can reshape distant societies through force? Why do they consistently ignore the warnings? And what does the historical record actually tell you about when intervention works and when it creates chaos? To understand the Iraq War, you first need to understand what the people who launched it were thinking, not in caricature, but as they understood their reasoning. In the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the Bush administration faced what they perceived as a transformed threat landscape. The attacks had demonstrated that non-state actors with apocalyptic ideologies could strike the American homeland with devastating effect. The fear, genuinely held, was that the next attack might involve weapons of mass destruction, and among the states suspected of pursuing such weapons while also supporting terrorism, Iraq sat at the top of the list. The case for war had multiple layers. The publicly stated rationale was weapons of mass destruction and Iraq's defiance of UN resolutions, but the strategic logic ran deeper. One school of thought, championed by figures like Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Perle, believed that transforming Iraq into a democracy would reshape the entire Middle East, that the region's authoritarianism was the root cause of the extremism that had struck America, and demonstrating democracy could work in the Arab world would trigger a cascade of reform. Another perspective, held by some in the intelligence community and the State Department, was more cautious, focused specifically on eliminating what they believed was an active weapons program. And there were those, including some in the uniformed military, who harbored profound doubts about whether any of it would work. The chain of events moved with remarkable speed. By late 2001, even as the Afghanistan campaign continued, planning for Iraq had begun. Throughout 2002, the administration built its case through speeches, through intelligence assessments that later proved deeply flawed, through a congressional authorization that passed with broad bipartisan support. The UN inspectors returned to Iraq in November 2002 and found no evidence of active weapons programs. Hans Blix, the chief inspector, asked for more time. The administration argued time had run out. By March 2003, the invasion began. The military campaign was swift and successful. The occupation was immediate chaos. The Iraqi army was dissolved, putting hundreds of thousands of armed men out of work. The Ba'athist bureaucracy was purged, eliminating the people who knew how to keep the electricity running and the water flowing. Sectarian tensions that Saddam's brutality had suppressed erupted into the open. By 2006, Iraq was experiencing a civil war that would kill tens of thousands and displace millions. The question that haunts the Iraq War is not just why the intelligence was wrong, but why so many warnings about the aftermath were ignored. This is where the historical pattern becomes impossible to miss. The Iraq War was not the first time a powerful nation convinced itself it could remake a distant society through military force, only to discover that the hard part was not winning the war, but managing what came after. In 1964, the United States faced what it believed was a clear threat in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, attacks on American destroyers that later investigations revealed were either misrepresented or fabricated, provided the justification for massive military escalation. The intellectual framework was domino theory. If South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. The confidence was overwhelming. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, one of the most analytically rigorous minds in American government, believed the war could be won through superior technology and firepower. American forces would pacify the countryside, train South Vietnamese forces, and demonstrate that communist insurgency could not succeed. The parallels to Iraq are striking. In both cases, intelligence was shaped to fit a predetermined conclusion. In both cases, military planners drastically underestimated the complexity of local politics and the resilience of insurgent resistance. In both cases, officials who raised doubts were marginalized. The CIA's analysis that the Vietnamese insurgency was primarily nationalist, not a Soviet-directed communist conspiracy, was dismissed. State Department officials who warned about the difficulty of nation-building in Iraq were sidelined. In both cases, the assumption was that American power could solve problems that were fundamentally political, not military. But the Vietnam parallel, while illuminating, misses something crucial about Iraq. Because the Iraq story actually begins much earlier, not with American intervention, but with British intervention. And that earlier chapter reveals how deep the pattern runs. In 1920, Britain found itself occupying 3 former Ottoman provinces that it had decided to combine into a single country called Iraq. The British assumed they could create a stable client state that would protect British oil interests and strategic position in the Gulf. Instead, they were immediately confronted with a massive revolt, and only afterwards installed a monarch, Faisal, a Hashemite prince with no connection to the territory, hoping indirect rule through an Arab figurehead would succeed where direct administration had failed. The 1920 Iraqi uprising involved tens of thousands of fighters across tribal and sectarian lines. It took roughly 5 months of intense fighting, significant military force, and the use of air power against civilian populations to suppress. The lessons the British took from 1920 were almost entirely wrong. They concluded that the revolt demonstrated the need for stronger central authority, not that the artificial state they had created lacked legitimacy. They built a political system that concentrated power in the hands of a Sunni minority, storing up sectarian resentment that would eventually explode. They drew borders that trapped Kurdish populations under Arab rule, creating tensions that persist to this day. When the British finally left, the state they created lurched from coup to coup until Saddam Hussein consolidated power through sheer brutality. This is the pattern that Iraq reveals. Powerful nations consistently underestimate the complexity of societies they intervene in. They assume their power translates into an ability to reshape political order. They ignore warnings from people who understand the local dynamics, and they discover, always too late, that the hard part is not the intervention, but the aftermath. But here is where the analysis becomes genuinely difficult, because the historical record does not point in only one direction. There are cases where intervention worked. Germany and Japan after World War II were transformed from aggressive authoritarian states into stable democracies. South Korea, defended by American forces, evolved from dictatorship into a prosperous democracy. The question is not whether intervention always fails, but what distinguishes success from catastrophe. The most persuasive historical analysis suggests several factors. Successful transformations have typically involved unconditional surrender and the complete discrediting of the previous regime, not just military defeat. They have involved massive, sustained economic investment over decades. They have involved genuine local demand for the political changes being implemented, and they have involved intervening powers willing to stay engaged for generations, not years. Iraq had none of these conditions. Saddam was removed, but Ba'athist networks remained. The occupation was woefully understaffed and under-resourced. Military planners had requested hundreds of thousands of troops. They received far fewer. Iraqi society was not a blank slate, but a complex web of sectarian, tribal, and political loyalties that had been violently suppressed, not resolved. And the American public had no appetite for a decades-long presence, even before the insurgency made staying untenable. The Soviet experience in Afghanistan offers another angle on the pattern. When Soviet forces invaded in 1979, they believed they were preventing the collapse of a friendly communist government on their border. They assumed their military superiority would quickly stabilize the situation. They assumed the Afghan population could be won over or suppressed. Instead, they faced a decade-long insurgency that bled the Soviet military, radicalized a generation of fighters who would later become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The superpower that intervened in Afghanistan was destroyed not by the intervention alone, but by the overreach it represented. What the historical pattern reveals is not that intervention is always wrong, but that the conditions for success are far more demanding than intervening powers typically acknowledge. The consistent failure mode is overconfidence, the belief that military power can solve political problems, that local complexities can be managed, that warnings can be safely dismissed. Iraq today remains haunted by the consequences. The Islamic State emerged directly from the chaos of the occupation, from the disbanded Iraqi army, from the sectarian grievances the occupation inflamed, from the power vacuum created when the state collapsed. Iran's influence in Iraq is now greater than at any point in modern history, precisely the opposite of what the invasion intended. The region is more unstable, not less, and the credibility of American intervention is so damaged that even cases where action might be justified are now viewed with deep suspicion. But the hardest part of this analysis is confronting the question that remains genuinely unresolved. Were there interventions that should have happened and did not? The Rwandan genocide, where 800,000 people were killed while the world watched, haunts policymakers precisely because non-intervention has costs too. The Syrian civil war, where American reluctance to intervene contributed to a catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, offers no easy lessons. The pattern of failed intervention does not mean that standing aside is always right. What the historical record suggests is that the question is not whether to intervene, but whether you understand what you are intervening in. The Iraq War failed not because intervention is impossible, but because those who launched it did not understand Iraq, did not understand its sectarian complexity, did not understand what would happen when the state collapsed, did not understand that winning the war was the easy part. Every figure who warned about these dangers, from State Department planners to intelligence analysts to allied governments, was dismissed or ignored. This is the pattern that should concern you, no matter your politics. Democracies can stumble into catastrophic wars when intelligence becomes politicized, when doubters are marginalized, and when confidence in military power blinds leaders to the complexity of what they are attempting. The warning signs were visible before Iraq. They were visible before Vietnam. They were visible before the British created Iraq in the first place. The question the Iraq War leaves behind is not whether it was right or wrong. Historians and citizens will debate that for generations. The question is whether the pattern can be broken, whether leaders will learn to distinguish between wars that can achieve their objectives and wars that will create chaos, whether intelligence communities will resist pressure to tell policymakers what they want to hear, whether publics will demand the kind of rigorous debate that might catch the flaws in the case for war before it is too late. Colin Powell spent his final years reckoning with what he had done in that UN chamber. He had trusted the intelligence he was given. He had believed the people who told him the case was solid, and he had lent his credibility to a war that turned into a catastrophe. The tragedy of Iraq is not just what happened, but what it reveals, that the pattern is not unique, that it has happened before, and that without the lessons it offers, it will happen again. Subscribe for more. We release new videos every week.